I've always been a very hands-on person, and I like the beauty of a machine that is well put together. I'm excited to work here because we are building a state-of-the-art particle accelerator in order to make medical radioisotopes more available for cancer treatments. I want to build something that matters, and this is something that matters. Being a member of IEEE, there's a whole community of people who are interested in what you're interested in. IEEE USA is my competitive edge.
All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the September edition of the IEEE-USA Government Relations Washington Update. I am Director of Government Relations, Eric Heilman here in Washington, D.C. We are back. It's been a while since we've had a full set of topics to talk about, and there's a lot going on, so let's jump right into it. As always, start with the top, work our way down to some of the issues that are important to us. What's going on in Washington right now? August recess is over. Congress is finally back in session after a several-week-long recess period that saw the national conventions for both parties, the first presidential debate. All those are in the rearview mirror now. They are back for one more month, and right now, all eyes are on making sure the government stays open. And so what does it mean for the actual policies and agenda that we'll be seeing, especially in Congress this month? We were able to get a copy of what's called a Dear Colleague letter that members of Congress or senators send to each other. They're addressed Dear Colleague, so we call them Dear Colleague letters. This is a letter that went out to senators from the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer of New York, that lays out his prospects for this month and the rest of the year. And there are a number of things in here that we can take from and use as good guideposts, because at the end of the day, the Senate Majority Leader does help set the agenda and work and make sure that his priority items, his party's priorities get on the Senate floor for a vote and have action on. As I said at the outset, the number one goal for this session of Congress, this little session before they go back out again for the November elections, is going to be to keep the government funded. September 30th is the deadline for the fiscal year, and if they don't do anything by then, the government will shut down. We've heard this before. We'll talk a little bit more about it in this webinar, but that's going to be priority number one. It's also important that among the few specific items that were listed in the Majority Leader's letter was an artificial intelligence. And clearly that is something that we and our members have been extremely diligent about prioritizing, working very hard on a number of different areas. And so we're cautiously optimistic there will be some wins on that before the end of the year. And then all eyes are going to be on this other large piece of legislation that has to pass, and we'll talk about it here shortly, the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. So that's kind of the big picture of what's going on. But there's also politics happening. We obviously are in the crazy season of elections. It's really, really in front of us now. We've got a lot of headwinds from both parties at the White House level, the congressional level. Everybody is looking for a good result from their perspective on November 5th. And what that tends to mean here in Congress is that the party that is in the majority of a particular chamber can use that majority to play a little politics and do a little electioneering for their candidate, for their parties. It happens all the time. And we're seeing the House Republican majority doing just that in focusing on the Harris-Walz ticket, and using the fact that they have the majority to hold congressional hearings or do some sort of official congressional committee action that shines a light on some Biden-Harris administration policies or some Walz policies in Minnesota that they can use, the Republicans can use to put out tweets and get the base garnered up and churn votes out for their side. This happens all the time. It's not unprecedented. It is political, and it does take up a little bit of space in Washington, but this just kind of gives you a flavor for kind of what starts happening normally about this time of year in an election year here in Congress. But back on AI and some of the policy issues that we really cared about, we had a really good win yesterday, a huge win, actually. If you have tuned into this webinar in the past, if you are an active IEEE member, and particularly if you managed to come here in April for the Congressional Visits Day, then you remember the Create AI Act, which is a piece of legislation that authorizes the NARE, the National Artificial Intelligence Research Resource. It's a piece of legislation that is one of our top legislative priorities. We were intimately involved in standing up what exists now in the NARE as a pilot program, and have been very, very supportive of more permanently making that program a fixture in the federal government through this legislation. And happily, the House moved on its version of this bill yesterday. The House Science Committee passed a number of bills, AI related, out of the committee. They approved them and sent them to the full House for consideration. And among those was the Create AI Act. If you recall, the Senate committee, counterpart committee, had already approved its version of the legislation in July. So we now have two committee approved bills that need to get passed by the respective chambers. But the fact that they are both positively reported out of committee and ready for the full floors on in each the House and Senate means there's a pretty good chance that these could get done. And by done, I mean signed and passed into law. But as we're going to talk about it in a minute here, bills like this, small bills that probably don't need a lot of floor time in either the House or Senate, precious floor time for debate and passage, they're going to need a vehicle to ride on. They're going to need a bigger piece of legislation to attach onto, because in reality, there's just not enough time and resources available to hold full floor debate and votes on the hundreds of different bills out there. So this is one that probably will need a vehicle, and we'll talk about it in a minute. Lots of other things going on in the tech policy world. I'll just briefly list these, and they're obviously right here. I don't need to go into a lot of them. Some of them we have spoken about and played a role in a little bit, but there's a lot of activity across the spectrum, no pun intended, as that is one of the items listed here. From hearings at the congressional level on FAA, on the BEAD program within NTIA, big picture competition from China, which is always a big topic in Congress with lots of areas to explore and examine and legislate on. There's a piece of legislation that's out there on kids' online privacy. We've spoken a little bit about some spectrum and broadband issues and the FCC's ability to auction some of those. And there's always talk about AI and deepfakes, especially in an election year, and active legislation is underway. So things are happening at other levels as well. How much of this will actually get across the finish line and succeed in terms of passed legislation and presidential signature into law? Probably pretty low for most of this, but you never say never until it's all done at the end of the year. And speaking of all done at the end of the year, we're back to the Groundhog Day of government shutdown. As I mentioned at the outset, September 30th is the end of the current fiscal year. If nothing happens in Congress before then to either keep the federal government funded under current levels or to pass a new budget, then the government will shut down. That's not going to happen this time around, at least not on September 30th. There is across the board bipartisan, bicameral agreement that this just isn't the time to force a government shutdown from either party, with some exceptions in the House Republican conference. And that does come a little bit from some of what we've heard Trump talk about. But we are seeing a lot of politics and a lot of horse trading and a lot of consternation, frankly, among some players on Capitol Hill to try and get something done between now and the end of this month. Usually, and precedentially, we've seen a continuing resolution piece of legislation, which basically means Congress punts on a new budget and just keeps the federal government going under existing authorities and existing budget levels. This is a CR. We see this all the time. If you've been tuning in to this webinar for the last year or so, or even just going back to March when we were talking about the previous year's fiscal year budget situation. You know what a CR is. The question always becomes, how long is that CR going to be for? Congress can pass a CR for an hour, a day, a year, a couple of months, and within that, that's where the politics start to play in, especially since we're in an election year, and the November elections, no matter what the results are, will likely have a big shakeup in who ends up controlling Washington when all those new representatives and senators and new president are sworn in January. So there's a lot of behind the scenes negotiation going on right now as to how long that CR is going to be for. And if there's anything that senators or members of Congress may want to attach to that piece of legislation, again, and use that as a vehicle. Most do not like to use a CR as a vehicle. They prefer it to be clean, i.e. no attachments, no other bills associated with it. Right now, the focus is in the House and the House Republicans and House Speaker Johnson. His preference had been to do a 6-month CR and essentially fund the government at current levels all the way to the end of March. Lots of thought behind that, lots of gambling. The assumption behind that is that Trump would win the White House, and then you'd be essentially negotiating a budget with a friendly president, and it would be a lot easier if you're a Republican. Well, Democrats obviously don't see it that way, and actually neither do some Senate Republicans. That camp tends to prefer a more shorter-term CR, something akin to 3 months, so that they can wipe the slate clean before the end of this year and before the new president comes in. So there's a lot going on right now. There was supposed to be a vote in the full House yesterday on Speaker Johnson's 6-month CR bill. He had to pull that from the floor because he didn't have enough votes to pass that. And what that means is that there were several Republicans within his own conference who wanted something different, had a different tactic, weren't going to support it. And so he had to pull it. And that's kind of dramatic. It has happened before, but it's certainly something worth watching. All this said, I do think we're going to get some sort of CR done before the end of this month. My guess is that it's closer to the 3-month version that House Democrats and some Senate, or all Democrats and some Senate Republicans want, but we're going to have to keep watching it. In the meantime, we're going to keep doing what we have been doing all year, and frankly, every year, advocating for proper funding for key research and science federal agencies, particularly the ones that are implementing the CHIPS and Science Act. We've talked about this ad nauseum, and we're going to keep doing this. This latest action that we took was to sign on to a letter with other computing organizations calling for full funding of some of these key agencies, NIST, NSF in particular. Letters like these are typical advocacy pieces that organizations like ours and many others sign on to. Those are sent to Capitol Hill. They are then used by proponents on Capitol Hill who want to try and promote and push and accomplish like-minded outcomes. So we got onto another letter. There's another one in the works right now that I'll probably throw up on the next one of these, but it's a constant drumbeat that's very, very important to us, and I know we've talked about. And in that vein, we have decided to keep this action alert going. We originally opened this for a short window several months ago, but this issue is this important, and it continues to stay open until those numbers are locked in. Members of Congress, senators still can weigh in with their leadership and others who are making those decisions on those numbers, and even cast votes on what these numbers are going to look like for these key agencies. So if you haven't gone in and taken action, fill out this very quick set of drop-down. It will pre-populate a letter that can be sent to your specific member of Congress, urging that this funding be allocated at its fullest amount. Please do. Hearing from individual constituents, individual voters, is very, very important to members of Congress. We, as registered lobbyists and professional advocates and in Washington insiders, we can go talk to elected officials and staffers. We can do a number of things to get things in front of them and get them persuaded and convince them to vote for something. But it does not have the power as an actual voter in their district saying they want something done. They think this is important. So please don't overlook this. And if you haven't done it, please take a quick minute to go and fill this out. The other big kind of piece of legislation that's out there, right? We talked about the funding piece, which is mostly this around the CR. The NDAA we talk about all the time as well, the National Defense Authorizations Act. This is one of very few must-pass bills that comes up every single year. And it is a comprehensive piece of legislation that essentially authorizes, i.e. statutorily grants authority to the Defense Department and other national security agencies to conduct their business. Obviously, a very important piece of policy, a very important piece of government, and it's the kind of thing that Congress takes very seriously. There are a number of things that it tends to lapse on or just not get to or punt, including funding the government, by the way. This is not one of them. They take a lot of pride in the fact that the NDAA has not officially lapsed since 1961. That's a really big deal. And that tells you that they will do everything they can to pass it. But must pass also means possible vehicle for other bills. And this gets back to what I spoke about earlier with some of those little pieces of AI legislation that we are supportive of. If you've got a big bill that everybody knows is going to pass, and everybody in Congress is going to do everything they can to make sure it passes, that means it's going to attract a lot of other items that can be tacked on as amendments. And this happens through a lot of different ways. And this is where we're going to be paying very close attention to the Create AI Act, another piece of AI legislation that was passed out of a Senate committee on government procurement and use of AI. That was a bill that I know we've spoken about on this webinar in the past that IEEE-USA AI Policy Committee members had a good deal of influence in terms of the drafting of that bill. So we care about the outcome of that one. But again, a very small piece of legislation. But in order for things like that to get passed, it needs to find that vehicle. And right now, the NDAA is one of the only ones out there for not just this, but hundreds of other small bills out there where there are constituencies and there are senators and members of Congress who care and really want to see them done. So we're going to be watching this quite a bit. As far as the NDAA itself and the substance of that bill, there's a lot in there that IEEE and USA and its members care about, have advocated for, largely in the R&D space. But it's a big bill, and the House and Senate, as with all pieces of legislation, have to pass their versions of it and then reconcile that through some sort of conference negotiation before it gets sent to the president. They're fairly far apart, not really far apart on these two. And it'll get done. It's just a matter of how, when, what gets left off, and this is where the horse trading comes in. This is where some of those other items that are attracted to that are looking for a ride get pulled in. These are kind of just some of the top issues and funding levels that this bill is looking at. But we are keeping a very close eye on this bill, as is most of Washington, frankly. So what's next? They're back in session. They're only here until the end of this month, and then they're gone again until the election. So all eyes are right now on the election. And if you're tracking any kind of polling, if you live in one of those swing states where you are already getting inundated with mail and commercials and people knocking on your door and standing on street corners and what the campaign trail likes to call honking waves, where you've got people on a corner with signs for some candidate, waving at you and asking you to honk for support. It's out there, it's everywhere. So but there are a number of states that are very, very close that will determine the outcome of who controls the Senate, who controls the House. And obviously the White House race is what it is. Don't need to speak much about that. It is the behemoth right now, and that outcome will be monumental in terms of what Congress does, not just after the election, but next year as well. And when they return from the election, the current Congress that we are in, which is a 2-year Congress, will still be in session. They'll know it's an interest. This is where lame duck. This is the lame duck period. You'll know the results of the election, But those people who won won't be sworn in until January. So you're going to have a Congress full of senators and members of Congress who have already announced their retirement at the end of this year. So they got nothing. They're done. You have some members of Congress and senators who lost their reelection, but they are still a sitting member, sitting senator, and they have to vote. They have to continue their work here in Washington. You're going to have all eyes pivoting 180 degrees away from the current Biden-Harris administration to whatever the new one is coming in. And that creates a whole different set of dynamics when it comes to legislating and policy making. And it gets crazy. And it continues going until what's called sine die. Complete adjournment. This session of Congress is done, and we roll over and start in January. And sometimes that sine die doesn't actually happen until the first day or two in January of the following year. So we are getting very close to kind of crazy season when the legislative sausage making is completely unpredictable, defies all sort of norms and sort of regular processes. And for those of us that work in this sausage making professionally, it's both fun, but also extremely stressful and aggravating because you really can't control or predict what's going to happen. We're getting close to that point. Pivoting away from what's going on in Congress and on the election campaign, I always like to try and find some stuff from the agencies that are of interest. Here was a pretty interesting funding award announcement from DOE on quantum computing research. $65 million for 38 different projects. There should be a link in the comments section where you can see all of the projects that got funded. But I wanted to highlight this underlined piece, which I emphasized. It was not emphasized in the press announcement itself. Contingent on congressional appropriations. This is something that is very, very important, and we talk about in context of the CHIPS and Science Act and a lot of other pieces of legislation. The difference between authorizations and appropriations. Clearly, DOE was authorized to spend this money, but Congress still has to appropriate it, and that's why we and many others are so adamant about Congress fulfilling their obligations when they passed the CHIPS and Science Act in 2022, which authorized lots of money for the and science piece of the CHIPS and Science Act. Much of that money has not been fully appropriated, including a lot of it going to the DOE Office of Science. So there's the hook right there. All this great stuff is coming out of DOE in terms of research funding, but it's kind of promised money that needs to be delivered on first. So I thought it was important to kind of share this little bit because it has a direct connection and hook to some of the legislative work that we've been doing and we've been asking many of you to kind of help out on. So let's transition to all the activities and events coming up. We are very busy this fall with a lot of wonderful events for our members and for the rest of the public where applicable. We launched earlier this year the IEEE-USA Congressional Outreach Program. We're calling it ICOP. This is essentially an event where we bring CVD back home. In other words, CVD, we bring IEEE members to Washington, organize you based on where you live, send you to Capitol Hill to meet with your legislators and talk about policy issues, talk about what you do. We're doing this in reverse this time, where recognizing that certainly not everybody can come to Washington on that specific window once a year, but we want to empower you and help you learn and understand what your senators and your legislative representatives are doing back home and how to meet with them back home, because they've got offices and staffs where they live, where you live. So we've started a program where we put together largely young professionals. That's kind of been the focus of this right now, because we are very eager to bring in our students, our young professionals, and really sort of explain to them the value of political engagement, the importance of actions here in Washington to what they are studying, what they're researching, to their jobs. So we have started targeting specific parts of the country where we are organizing meetings between IEEE members and their members of Congress at home. The first one was in Idaho. This next one is coming up next week in the Atlanta area, where we have a small group of IEEE members who have signed up as part of this program, who will be meeting with representatives from both of the two U.S. senators in Georgia, as well as two different members of Congress, McCormick and McBath, a Republican and a Democrat. We're going to keep doing this. If you are a YP, a student, and you have interest in this, let us know. There's a lot of opportunity here, and we'd love to kind of keep this program going. So that's first up on the docket for us. Then yours truly will be attending and moderating a panel at the Oceans 2024 conference in Halifax. This is an annual conference that is co-sponsored by our friends at the IEEE Oceanic Engineering Society. IEEE-USA was asked to help put together a panel, policy-related, regulatory-related, and so we put together a panel that's specific to autonomous ships and the regulatory environment and regimes surrounding them. So I will be traveling up to Halifax at the end of this month to moderate this panel. It's going to be a great opportunity to talk about IEEE-USA, to expose ourselves to a little bit of a bigger audience. Even though it's in Canada, there clearly will be a lot of Americans up there, a lot of US-based IEEE members, and a great opportunity to kind of get involved in the tech space as it pertains to maritime issues. Not something I think we've really traditionally done. So this is going to be a great event. If by chance any of you happen to be up there, please come by, please say hi, please stop by our panel. And then we've advertised this before, but it's coming up. This is our next kind of pop-up event related to the semiconductor industry. Packaging is obviously a very important step in the semiconductor processing and supply chain manufacturing stream. So we're doing a one-day event in Scottsdale where we are focusing on that particular aspect of the industry. It's going to be a great event. We've already got a great lineup. I'm also going to be spending some time with the ASU IEEE chapter. So if you're in Arizona, please stop by. And then our next iWork, which again, I know we've talked about, but we're really putting a lot of meat on these bones as well. This one is promising to be probably our best iWork yet. It's our third, I believe, and is specific to aerospace and defense, which is new. Normally, we had kind of kept it fairly open-ended in terms of a tech policy, a tech hub and ecosystem of a particular region. But this year, this time around, because it's Huntsville, we thought it made sense to really zero in. And right now, this is shaping up to be a spectacular event. That's all I got. I feel like I crammed a lot into a very short amount of time. I'm going to pause for a minute and open up the comment section and see if there are questions or comments. And I understand that it might be kind of difficult sometimes to find where you type those in. So I'll give you a minute to try and find that in case you want to say something. If you can't find it, if you're not quite sure how you want to, whatever, you can always call me or email me. I do everything I can to respond to emails I get from you as quickly as possible. And so please feel free to do so. Seeing some good comments about the action alert. Somebody is in Nashville saying hello. Thank you very much. See some interest in the ICOP program. Feel free to contact me directly on that one. I can put you in touch with Annie Perrin-Grisham, who is my colleague here in Washington, who is essentially running point on that program. And she's done amazing work in the very short amount of time that it's been launched. Let's see. I think that's it. As always, email, call with any questions. Next month's Washington update, I think, is going to be interesting. Right now, I'm thinking of making it very specific to the election. There's not going to be much policy making going on in Washington at all. It's going to be back to crickets the way it was in August, because everybody's going to be home campaigning, and we will be just under a month away from the election at that point. And I think it might be fun to kind of dive a little bit more into the election with as much of a lens as I can on the members of Congress and senators that we work with, the types of policies that our members care about and work in, and see if I can tailor this a little bit to IEEE and IEEE-USA members. So stay tuned for that one. All right. Seeing nothing else, I will adjourn and say thank you, and we'll see you next month.